Anything below was like.
Okay, I think we got it all figured out.
Sea urchins. Second.
So, just waiting for the PowerPoint to load up here for Learning Plan 12. There it is. Get started here.
For like 10, 15. Like everybody else. Come on.
Thing. You know, they do a lot.
There we go.
Don't hand me that bowl. Don't hand me that. Did you make it?
It's a girl thing.
I'm not later. I
Can't
know.
make a girl out of a boy thing.
Yes, you can.
All right.
Workmanship. Oh, girl, this was 90% of everything.
That is a little thing.
That's one of the last ones that next to the girl at the bar.
Okie dokie. Let's see here. Now we got.
I hang with it.
Wait for this computer to stop being pokey
I
here.
go to the race car.
All right, great.
Sorting pits.
All right, so as far as the digestive system goes, when we look at the digestive system really comes down to two main divisions or areas. We have what's called the alimentary canal, which is essentially the tube, starts at the mouth, ends at the anus, and then we also have the accessory structures of digestion. So these would be structures that are not part of that digestive tube per se, but they are going to secrete substances that aid in the digestion. So we're going to look at all of these structures today. So the first thing we do, I want to do is I want to start off by talking about what are the digestive processes, because these are the things that are important for us just to understand. And we see them here on this figure, which is also in your book. So we start off with ingestion, and that's simply just putting the food in your mouth. Then we have what's called the propulsion. So the propulsion is what you see over here, this side of the screen. Wake up, Mr. Penn. There we go. Thank you. All right, so it's propulsion. So things like swallowing, peristalsis. Now, we'll talk a little bit about peristalsis as we go on and things like segmentation, but let's cut to the chase right here while we've got it. So peristalsis is essentially the movement of substances throughout the digestive tract or the alimentary canal. So peristalsis, you have a tube, and then in this tube you have smooth muscle. And so you get this wave-like contraction that's going to take a bolus of food and move it along the tract from beginning to end. That's what peristalsis is. That's going to be happening through the entire length of the alimentary canal once the food enters the esophagus here. So we have a voluntary stage, which is the swallowing. And then once you swallow the food and it gets in your esophagus, the rest is completely involuntary. It's going to happen automatically. It's going to move its way throughout the alimentary canal. We have another definition here, segmentation, which is part of the next thing that's mentioned in your notes, which is the mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion is the physical churning and the physical breaking apart of the food that you eat. So if we think about the role of the digestive system, we think about the functions of the digestive system. Functions of the digestive system. What are some of the things the digestive system does? Well, let's think about it. Number one, the role of the digestive system is to take the food that you eat. Well, I guess this is really the primary function of it, is to take the food that you eat and break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until it's small enough to be absorbed through the wall of the esophagus so that it can be transported throughout the body to be used to create energy. Okay, that's the role of the digestive system. And so if you look at how we break down the food, into smaller pieces. Oops. Not Reese's, pieces. If we look at how we break down the food into smaller pieces, it starts with a mechanical breakdown. What's the first thing that your body does mechanically to break down the food? Let's say that you chew into let's say you're eating a meatball. You stick half the meatball in your mouth. What's the first thing you do?
Do it.
Yeah, you chew it. That's the first process of the mechanical digestion. You start chewing it. The reason why you're chewing it, two main reasons. One, so you don't choke on it. Number two, you want to break it into smaller pieces. Because you have digestive components, as in the saliva coming from the salivary glands, that has the potential, depending on what food you eat, we'll talk about that a little bit, depending on the food that you eat, to start breaking that down. Okay, so let's picture we've got this complete meatball here. Let's say that it's small enough for us to stick that meatball in our mouth. If we had to let digestive juices and components get at this thing to break it down, how long would it take if you never broke this meatball into smaller pieces? How long would it take for you to get to the inside of the meatball and actually break that apart? If you didn't physically pull it apart. Take a long time, right? So by chewing it, and then through the churning that happens in the stomach and the segmentation of the small intestine, what you're doing is you're basically breaking it up into smaller pieces. And then when you have smaller pieces, now you've got so much more surface area available that the digestive components can get at it and break it down chemically. See, so we have two different types of digestion that happen. We have, well, actually, it is the digestion itself, but we have a mechanical type of digestion, and we have a chemical type of digestion, mechanical and chemical. So mechanical is the physical breaking apart, but the chemical is taking those digestive juices and breaking apart the food stuffs with the digestive juices that we see secreted by the various structures in the digestive system. So we know the stomach is going to churn that stuff. I mean, we can actually sometimes feel that or hear that when the stomach is actually moving, because the stomach is a muscular organ and it churns up and kind of breaks down the food. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the stomach does in a little bit. But segmentation is something that might be new to us. So if you think about the process of segmentation, what segmentation really is, segmentation is kind of the sectioning off of the intestine. So let's say this is the small intestine. We've got a bolus of food here. So what we're going to see, and there's a picture in your book that depicts this, we're going to take that bolus of food and we're going to sort of pinch off the small intestine so we keep the bolus of food in this area. And then what happens is we start to just contract back and forth along this section. Back and forth, we have contractions. Kind of like if you can imagine a tube of toothpaste that's about like half the toothpaste is out of it. So you've got some toothpaste left in the tube, but there's some of it that's flattened out. So if you put the cap on the toothpaste, the cap on the tube of the toothpaste, and then you squeeze the end where the toothpaste is, everything's going to squish down to the other end, right? And if you squeeze back then on that other end, everything's going to squish back the other way. And so if you took your hands and were massaging this tube of toothpaste, that's kind of like what segmentation is. So what you're doing is you're essentially mixing and churning the food by sectioning off small areas of the small intestines and then letting it go at it. So that's what segmentation is. So after we mechanically break down the food and then we let the chemicals get at the food and we start to digest the food chemically and break it apart, now we've broken apart the components so small that now they can be absorbed. One of two places. Number one, we can absorb the food through the blood vessel. So carbohydrates and proteins, those will be digested and absorbed through the blood vessel. Not digested through the blood vessel, but absorbed through the blood vessel. Fats or lipids, too large to fit into the blood vessels. So the fats and lipids, they will end up entering the lymphatic vessels, which are found in the area of the digestive system, and these are called lacteals. Well, the singular is a lacteal. It's a special name for a lymphatic vessel in which the lipids are going to be absorbed. Whatever doesn't get absorbed ends up in the large intestine, and then the last step of the digestive process is the elimination of whatever your body didn't need or want or didn't absorb, and that's a process that we call defecation. So here's a comparison and a contrast between peristalsis and segmentation, and you can see that peristalsis moves the bolus of food through the intestine or the alimentary canal, whereas segmentation, again, I said that we have the sectioning off. And what they're showing you here is that you got this tan-colored bolus of food here, and a darker colored bolus of food. And through segmentation, this kind of squishing it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, eventually you're going to mix the food in. And if you can envision, along with this, you're taking digestive juices and the digestive chemicals and mixing it in as well. You're going to see how we can get the chemicals in the middle of this mixture so that we can digest the food thoroughly, inside and out. All right. We think about how the gastrointestinal tract is innervated and how it's wired. Basically, we have some different things that are going to stimulate the movement and the action of the gastrointestinal tract. It starts, first of all, here with the external stimuli. If we see food or we smell it, we can taste it. Even if we think of food, what happens is that signal is going to be sent to the central nervous system, and then through the central nervous system, it's going to send a message down to something called the intrinsic nerve plexus, or we call it the gut brain. So essentially, the digestive system has its own independent nervous system that works in concert with the central nervous system, but it kind of does its own thing, and it can work on its own. Or, on the other hand, if we end up with food in the gastrointestinal tract, that itself will stimulate some receptors. Maybe we'll change the chemical environment of the gastrointestinal tract. Or maybe we'll change the level of fluids, the fluid environment. Or maybe we will stretch some of the components of the digestive tract. And through these mechanisms, again, we'll stimulate that gut brain. Then what's going to happen when we stimulate that gut brain is that we basically have an effect on the smooth muscle. The smooth muscle gets stimulated, and the gastrointestinal tract is going to start to contract to move things along, the peristalsis and the segmentation, but also we start to secrete the digestive juices from the different components and structures that are going to be found within the digestive tract. All right, so when we look at the digestive tract obviously is an abdominal cavity resident. It lives in the abdominal cavity. Now this is below the diaphragm. Before that, it's in the thoracic cavity. That's just basically the esophagus. But once you get below the diaphragm, now we'll see the stomach, we'll see the pancreas, we're going to see the liver, we're going to see the intestines, and so on and so forth. So when we look at how the intestines are anchored within the abdominal cavity, we see that there's a structure here called the mesentery. A mesentery. It's like a connecting stalk that keeps the digestive tract components anchored so that they don't move. But there's another function of the mesentery, and that is to provide the digestive organs with the cardiovascular structures. Remember we talked about the mesenteric artery, the mesenteric vein? Well, that's the connection here, the mesentery right here. So you can't just reach into someone and grab their intestines and pull it out. It doesn't come out loosely because it's anchored through that mesentery and that cardiovascular type of connection there. But not only do we have a mesentery that anchors the digestive structures dorsally or posteriorly, but we also have a ventral mesentery here also that can anchor it in. So sometimes some of these structures are anchored in the back and the front, sometimes just the back. Like the liver, for example, is anchored both anteriorly and posteriorly. But most of the digestive tract is just anchored posteriorly. We're not really talking about this over here. When we talk about the kidneys, then we can talk about how the kidneys used to be in the abdominal cavity and they moved backwards, but that's not a concept we're going to talk about right now. So if you look at the alimentary canal, you're going to see that the alimentary canal comes with some layers to it. It's not just one tube, it's a tube that has many different layers. And those main three areas, I should say, well, I guess it's four technically. No, three. Here it goes. Mucosa, submucosa, and the serosa. These are the three layers. All right, so if we look at the innermost layer of the gastrointestinal tract, we have what we call the mucosa. And the innermost layer of the mucosa is an epithelial layer. What kind of tissues make up the epithelial lining of the alimentary canal? Now you have to think way back. What's that?
Columnar.
Close. Nope. You're closer with the columnar, but not a. Remember, this is one of the in-betweeners, one of the ones that's like the outliers. Remember, we had squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and then we had transitional, and then we had the other one. Remember that one? Was it?
Pseudostratified.
Yeah, pseudostratified. And you also see columnar as well. So pseudostratified columnar / some columnar. And the reason why I say pseudostratified and the columnar is because in some areas of the gastrointestinal tract, what you're going to see are mucus-producing cells, those goblet cells, which are found in more so in the pseudostratified columnar. But we also see columnar as well. What's the function of the columnar epithelial tissue? Primarily, I mean, we see some secretion, but what else is it primarily responsible for? Think about what the overall goal of the gastrointestinal tract is. What is the function of the gastrointestinal tract? To do what?
Absorb nutrients.
You got it, right there. So the function of the pseudostratified columnar, or the columnar epithelium, is absorption. All right? So that absorptive structure is found here in the mucosa. And now you think, well, how the heck, if we got this big thick layer of this big thick walled structure here called the gastrointestinal tract, let's say this is the intestines, for example, how the heck are we going to get stuff through all those layers? Well, it doesn't have far to go, because we're going to see in the next layer, which is the submucosa, that is where you're going to find all the vasculature. See, the blood vessels are right there. So it really doesn't have to travel very far. It doesn't have to be absorbed very, very far. It just basically has to make its way through this one layer. All right, so deep to the epithelium, we have the supportive tissue underneath, like the connective tissue underlayment, which is called the lamina propria, and then we have a muscular layer underneath that, but that's a thinner muscular layer. Then deep to that, we have the submucosa. And the submucosa is basically this layer in between here, which contains the nerves, the blood vessels, and the lymphatic vessels. This is where we absorb all the components from the epithelial layer of the mucosa. External to that, we have something called the muscularis externa. It's 2 layers of muscle, but they run parallel to each other. So we have an inner layer. So if you envision the tube here, we have an inner layer which has these circular layers of muscle. These are the structures that are involved in both the peristalsis and the segmentation. But then over the top of that, we have longitudinal muscles which run the length of that gastrointestinal tract. So between the two of those contracting, that's how we perform the peristalsis and also the segmentation. Finally, we have the outermost layer called the serosa. Serosa is kind of like the skin on the outside of the intestines. So if you want to think of it in its literal sense, or that we can relate to, if any of you had like bratwurst or wieners with the casing on them, what's that casing made up of? Anybody know?
Intestine.
Yeah, it's intestines. So when you're biting into that brat and it kind of pops, you know, and the meat comes out from there, you know, or the biting that. What's that?
Just ruined it.
Yeah, I did, right? That's the serosa. That's the serosa that you're biting into. So that's basically the epithelial tissue, connective tissue, stuff like that. So that's what it is. Sorry to ruin it for you. It'll be okay. You'll get over it. You'll get over it.
It's fine.
Yeah, you still eat it, right? You'll know it. It's basically like sheep intestines or, intestines, but that's essentially what the natural casings are. So I know you take anatomy and then you think twice about, or a couple times about what you're eating, right? Talk about ham, chicken. Now we're talking about the brats, right?
Are all brats like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, not all. No, they primarily are, yeah. If you feel better, just take the casing off and just eat the meat out from inside, right?
What was the thing that you were eating?
I tried it. Yeah,
But what was it?
try and pay.
An
Never touch it
intestine?
again, yeah.
What'd you try?
Try and pay.
What's that?
Like, it's like some intestines of like some goat or cow or something. I don't know.
Tri-pay, it's called?
Yeah.
Huh, interesting.
It wasn't good.
No,
No.
no. It is what it is. If you I don't know. If it ruins it for you, well, it ruins it for you, but you'll find out eventually. No, vegetarian sounds pretty good after a while, right? All right, so I still like meat, but so that makes you think about what you're eating. All right, so what we're going to do now from this part out is we're just going to talk about the different organs that are found in the gastrointestinal system. So we start with this one. This is the obvious one, the mouth. Not going to spend a lot of time on this. So the mouth is basically where the food goes into. Some of the structures that we see in the mouth that I just want to point out. We know what the lips are. We know what the teeth are. We know what the tongue is. We see that we have some of the salivary gland duct openings here, the base of the tongue. We also have a salivary gland opening in the cheeks. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is where the ducts empty out. Sometimes, once in a while, these ducts will get clogged. Has anybody ever had a salivary duct get clogged? Or I have, like twice in my lifetime, and never wish that upon anybody. It's like the worst ever. Because every time you eat something, your salivary gland contracts, but it can't go anywhere. So it's like significant pain in your underneath. And then when it finally releases, you get like a mouthful of saliva that's like days old. It's really gross. So hopefully you never have to go through that ever. All right. So anyway, sometimes people look in your throat and they want to look at your tonsils. Well, the tonsils aren't necessarily colored this lighter color, but this is where they're located. So it's kind of like this little collection of tissue on the sides of the mouth. In the back, we have this uvula that hangs down as well. That's about as sophisticated as the mouth is. On the tongue itself, we have some salivary glands. Sorry, back up. Sorry, not salivary glands. We have some what are called papilla. I'm getting ahead of myself here. They come in different varieties. So when you look at the actual tongue, and we talked about this before when we were covering the senses, these bumps that you see on the tongue are not the taste buds. These are the papilla. So we have the valate. We covered this already, right? When we talked about the senses, right? So we don't have to go through this much, but we over here the foliate, and then we have the fungiform that are the smallest, and then I'm sorry, the fungiform are the bigger ones, and then the filiform are the smaller ones. So just a quick review of that. Okay, so here are the salivary glands. In the cheek is the largest of the salivary glands. It's called the parotid gland. And the parotid gland will secrete saliva that will end up coming through the lateral wall of the cheek. So you might be able to find it. It's up, located like in the cheek when you start getting to like about where the molars are. So if you reach your tongue up there, you can find, some of you might even be able to perceive a little bit of a bump. That's where the parotid gland releases its saliva. And then we have two that lie underneath the tongue. One is called the submandibular gland, because that one is basically located underneath the jawbone or the mandible. And you can see the submandibular duct is going to release its secretions here, very anterior. And then we have the sublingual. Lingual refers to tongue, language. So sublingual gland is underneath the tongue. And then you can see there are about 5 or 6 duct openings there at the base of the tongue. So between all of these, this is what's providing your mouth with the saliva, which is going to moisten, lubricate, and even start to partially digest some of the food depending on what it is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the teeth. Here are your teeth. Okay, we know what teeth are. Boom. The teeth are held in place by something called what we call the periodontal ligament. And when we talked about the different joint types, we talked about the gomphosis, the peg in the socket. That was this type of joint. So the tooth can move a little bit, it can wiggle a little bit, but it's held firmly in place. We have a nerve that comes up into the middle of the tooth. So the tooth is a living structure. The pulp cavity is what you're concerned with. If you ever break your tooth, chip your tooth, you want to make sure that you're not into that cavity, because then you've got a live nerve ending exposed there, painful, not good for your tooth as far as if you suffer damage to that, then the tooth can essentially die. That's why you would end up with something called a root canal. But the root canal actually is the structure. It's the name of a process, but it's also the name given to the canal which carries the blood vessels and the nerves into the tooth. One of the things I didn't realize, I just found this out a couple weeks ago. My daughters were going to the dentist to get checked. You know, I guess I never outwardly wondered this, but he basically provided me with information I didn't know. So you look at our teeth, and obviously our teeth have a root that anchors the tooth into place. Do you ever wonder why, when a child loses their primary teeth, why there's no root on that tooth? But there actually is a root on that tooth. while they're young. See, but when the tooth comes out, there's no root, right? It's kind of like this tooth with kind of like a hollowed out end to it. Like you basically get about this much of the tooth right here. Come on, where's my pen? You get about this much of the tooth when that tooth comes out. Well, whatever happened to the root? What the dentist told me is that when the adult teeth are coming in underneath it, when the adult teeth start coming up, what happens is the body will actually reabsorb the root of that baby tooth, essentially. So it loses its anchor. That's why it gets wiggly. And then that's how it comes out, because there's no root anchoring that in anymore. And then the adult tooth will come in behind it with a root, and then it's there for as long as you live, or as long as you have it until it gets removed. So that's how it works. Which makes me think, they should figure out whatever that is that causes your body to reabsorb the root, because they could do that and like inject you in the area of like your wisdom teeth with that. Then you could reabsorb the root of the wisdom tooth, and the wisdom tooth would come right out, right? So I had to yank that sucker out for those who get your wisdom teeth taken out. Okay, so the esophagus. The esophagus is that muscular tube that runs between the mouth and the stomach. And it's not just an open, hollow tube. You can see that it actually, when it's relaxed, is folded. Now, these layers should look very similar to you, or familiar to you, I should say. We have the mucosa. We have the submucosa. We have the muscularis externa. And then instead of the serosa, we have something called the adventitia. So these are those 4 layers that we talked about before. All right, so when we swallow, we have 3 different phases to swallowing. We have what's called the buccal phase. This is when we push the bolus of food. After we chewed it, we push the bolus of food up toward the hard palate of our mouth. The food is going to slide backwards. This is then called the pharyngeal esophageal phase, because now we're pushing the food back into the pharynx, which is this region right here. It's that muscular tube. It's basically your throat. Once we do that, then we'll swallow, and then the food is going to end up in the esophagus, and then it's going to make its way down and then enter the stomach. Stomach is a muscular organ, primarily. Its primary role is to break down proteins. You'll see that different areas of the body digest different things. So we have essentially several different layers of muscle. We have a longitudinal layer, which is the most external. Then we have a circular layer underneath that. We have an oblique layer under that. And that's because the stomach's job is to contract and churn and basically mix the food with the digestive juices that it secretes. But the stomach is expandable. It's stretchy. That's why we see these little folds here in the stomach, which we call the rugae. It allows the stomach to expand, to contract, or to get smaller when it doesn't have food in it. Opening to the stomach is through the region we call the cardia, or the cardiac region of the stomach. We have a sphincter at the bottom of the esophagus that keeps the food in the stomach, so that way as the food is digested, it doesn't slosh back up with all those digestive juices that can be very irritating to the mucosa of the esophagus, because the mucosa of the esophagus is not designed to handle the strong digestive juices that are in the stomach. Sometimes that valve is insufficient, so you end up with what we call heartburn. And that heartburn is a term given to the sensation that you feel because of the digestive juices of the stomach making their way up and splashing against the esophagus. You don't want this all the time, because that is one of the ways that people can develop conditions like esophageal cancer, for example, because it's not designed to withstand it for a significant amount of time. So if you're dealing with heartburn a lot, may want to get it looked at. Another thing that's really helpful sometimes for heartburn is conservative approaches are digestive enzymes, because sometimes the food is sitting in your stomach for a long period of time because it's not able to digest the food and break it down. By consuming digestive enzymes, that helps with the digestion of the food. Less gas, less bloating, and so on and so forth. Talk about, I don't know if we talk about it so much in this class, but I know in advanced state people talk more about digestion itself. So we have this dome-shaped region to the stomach at the top. That's called the fundus. Then we have the curvature here. This is the greater curvature because it's a larger one. And over here we have the lesser curvature. And then the end of the stomach, or the distal part of the stomach, is what we call the pylorus. And we have a pyloric sphincter, which keeps the stomach closed off to the beginning of the intestines, called the duodenum. Now we talk a lot about the average person, the average lay person is going to talk about how the stomach secretes hydrochloric acid. And that's what's irritating to your stomach, or irritating to your, everything else. And yes, your stomach does secrete hydrochloric acid, but the hydrochloric acid itself is not designed to digest the food. The hydrochloric acid is a component that your stomach secretes to allow for the other digestive components to become active so that they can break down the food that you're consuming. So in your stomach, you have what are called gastric pits, and they're these deep pits that extend down into the submucosa, or toward the submucosa of the stomach. And we have several different cells that we'll see. So we have some of the epithelial cells here that secrete mucus to protect the wall of the stomach. We have some parietal cells. We have some chief cells. And we have what's called an enteroendocrine cell. Your first term for today is the term digest. We'll finish up with something, then we'll take a break because we've been yakking for a while here. So the way that this works is you have the chief cell, which you see in purple, the parietal cell, which you see as blue. Now the chief cell secretes what's called pepsinogen, which is an inactive digestive secretion. But then we have the parietal cell, which secretes the hydrochloric acid. Now, again, the reason why the hydrochloric acid is beneficial is because the hydrochloric acid, when combined with pepsinogen, is going to convert the pepsinogen into pepsin. Pepsin is now active, and this can digest the proteins. So the hydrochloric acid itself doesn't digest anything, but it activates the inactive pepsinogen, converting it to active pepsin. That's how it works. Okay, before we get to that, let's just talk a little bit about the stomach itself and what it does. We might come to it again later. I can't recall if I have the slides on that or not, but let's just talk about the stomach and then we'll take a break. Just get out of here and back to this picture. Okay, so the stomach, like I said, is responsible for digesting proteins. But that's not that ends up in your stomach. Everything you eat ends up in your stomach. The lipids, carbohydrates as well. Because we have three main foodstuffs that we consume. So all the food that you consume can be categorized into one of three categories or more, but it's either going to be a protein, it's either going to be a carbohydrate, or it's going to be a lipid, or a combination of both. So like, for example, if you consume milk, milk has a little bit of carbohydrate in it, a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat, a little bit of everything. But like if you eat fruit, for example, fruit is primarily carbohydrate. If you eat a piece of meat or something like that, obviously that's protein. So the stomach is a holding tank, but it's also a digester. So what we see a couple times, we see several things happening. I'll kind of describe some of these things if it's helpful to you. So if you consume a lot of fruit, along with a protein, a meat that you don't chew very well, now think about what your stomach has to do. Now, let's say that you're eating steak, and you just kind of swallow the steak without really chewing it much, and now you've followed up with some fruit. Because you didn't chew your food very well, now your stomach has to do its job, which is to break down that protein until it's small enough and digested enough to pass on to the intestines, because the intestines aren't going to do anything with the protein. So the protein digestion has to happen in your stomach, otherwise it's not going to happen. Okay. So sometimes, if you don't chew your food very well, you're sitting there digesting that protein for an hour or more. That your stomach just keeps working. But that fruit doesn't need to be digested. It's just sitting there. What happens to fruit after it sits around for a while in a warm environment?
Ferments.
Yeah, it starts to ferment, which causes the creation of what? Gas, right? So sometimes when people eat proteins and fruits together, or proteins and some other carbohydrate together, with the fermentation that's coming from that carbohydrate as it's sitting there waiting, you get gas and bloating and indigestion. So that the stomach isn't going to selectively say, well, you're a fruit, you can pass through while I keep the protein. Nothing goes until the protein's ready to go. Okay, so that's one thing to think about. I talked about the digestive enzymes as well, and how the digestive enzymes are helpful. Now, here's another thing. What are the things that, let's say people are struggling with indigestion or heartburn? What do people take? What are some things that people take?
Calcium carbonate.
Tums, what else?
Calcium carbonate.
Yeah, calcium carbonate, what else? Like a Prilosec or, stuff like that. And what's the ultimate goal of these products? To decrease what? To reduce the amount of what? Stomach acid, right? Which is hydrochloric acid. So we just saw what hydrochloric acid does. So if we decrease the amount of hydrochloric acid, is that going to help with digestion of the proteins or not help?
Not help.
Not help, right? Because you need hydrochloric acid in order to digest the food properly. So one of the problems that people have without even realizing it is that their indigestion issues come from actually a lack of hydrochloric acid or an insufficiency of hydrochloric acid. And then what they do is they take an antacid or something that prevents the release of acid on top of it. So yes, they're going to have less heartburn because there's less acid burning the bottom of their esophagus, but is it really helping them digest their food better? Probably not. Here's another thing. Where is it going with this? Oh yeah, calcium. Okay, so if you take like a Tums, a Rolaids, something like that, one of the things they talk about is how there's calcium in it. And so calcium is helpful for you, beneficial for your diet, right? Well, there are different types of calcium you can take. You can take a calcium carbonate, you can take a calcium citrate, you can take a calcium chelate. So of those three, which one? And you already mentioned it. So of those three, what's the type of calcium that's found in like the antacids? Calcium carbonate. So number one, calcium carbonate is not a very good absorbing form of calcium. So for all the calcium carbonate you take into your body is going to absorb very little of it. So if you're taking it for that reason, you're not getting a lot of calcium out of it. The other thing is calcium decreases the amount of hydrochloric acid that's present. That's why you take it. See, so the more calcium you take, the less effective your body is going to digest that food. So that's why the antacids and those types of things aren't necessarily the ideal thing for you to take, given that, if you know how the digestive system works. So a lot of times, if you take a more conservative approach, which, like I said, is like a digestive enzyme, if you take a digestive enzyme, you look at it, and a lot of times they're going to include hydrochloric acid as part of that digestive enzyme. Why? Because they're trying to increase the amount of hydrochloric acid available to help you digest your food. Plus, it's going to contain some of the components that are going to help completely digest your food. So one of the most common over-the-counter digestive enzymes commercially that's out there is Beano. You ever heard of Beano? That's a digestive enzyme. There's also papaya enzyme, which also is fairly effective, but there are other digestive enzymes that you can take. And if you look at the ingredients, they'll have different types of enzymes in there that are integrated in to help you digest your food better. So just a thought, food for thought. It gives you something to think about. All right, let's take a break and come back at 10 after, and then we'll pick up where we left off, and I'm guessing we're going to get through the rest of the digestive system. We can hop into the respiratory system now. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about here very briefly is just some of the things that regulate the release of gastric juice within the stomach. So we have 3 different phases. We have the cephalic phase, which is initiated from the brain, the gastric phase, which comes from within the stomach itself, and then the intestinal phase. So it's actually the intestines that are sending signals to the stomach to inform the stomach or tell the stomach what's going on in the environment of the intestines relative to digestion. So when we talk about the cephalic phase, seeing and thinking of food or smelling the food or tasting it, those are going to send signals to the stomach saying, get ready. They're going to say, get ready, there's food coming. And so you might have experienced this too. If you're a little hungry and you start to smell food or you start thinking about food, you can hear your stomach start to gurgle a little bit because there's air in your stomach, and that the stomach is kind of getting moved. The air is getting moved around your stomach. So you hear that sort of growling in your stomach, as we call it. Once the food gets into your stomach, now what's going to happen is the food is going to start to stretch the wall of the stomach as the food is entering. And so that's going to cause the stomach to start to release the secretions as the chemical environment changes. Again, we're releasing gastrin into the blood saying, okay, rest of the digestive system, get ready because the food is coming. Once the food starts to make its way out of the stomach into the duodenum of the small intestine, now that's going to stimulate what we call the intestinal gastrin to release in the blood. And then that's going to have an effect on the stomach, saying basically, okay, we're reaching the end here. You can start to ramp down your secretion and your activity because we're starting to get to the end here. So on the left, you see some of the stimulatory effects or events, and then here are the inhibitory events that are occurring. They're basically like the opposite. So one of the things, again, here, we have excessive acidity in the stomach. We're going to start to shut things down. Emotional stress shuts it down. So if you've ever had that where you're trying to eat after learning some distressing news, it's like almost impossible. You have like no appetite and your food doesn't digest very well and it just kind of sits there in your stomach. It's because your emotional input and emotional feedback is shutting down and deactivating the stomach, so it's not working well. This picture is just showing you basically that release of hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells and how that all happens. It's not a major point of what we're going to talk about here. So the stomach itself has peristaltic waves, but they come in a little bit of a very varied form here because they're basically sloshing the food back and forth. It's not really moving through smoothly like it would in the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. It kind of is in this holding tank. So the food is going to get pushed toward the pylorus. As you see here, this is the propulsion stage. And then close to the end of the stomach, we're going to see a lot of muscular contraction. The stomach is going to work to essentially grind that food. It's kind of grinding it back and forth, kind of trying to break apart that food manually through its muscular action. Then what it does is it engages in what we call retropulsion. So it kind of pushes the food back at the same time that it's squirting a little bit through that pyloric valve. And in this way, then it's just depositing smaller and smaller and smaller amounts into the small intestine. I want to make sure that I'm where I want to be. Okay, there we go. Okay, so once we get beyond the stomach, now we're going to see the involvement of two accessory glands, two accessory structures of the gastrointestinal tract, the pancreas and the liver. Now, these are two organs that you probably heard of, But you might, and oh, the third one, gallbladder. So you might have heard of all these structures, but you're thinking, what the heck do they do? Or you've heard of the pancreas, and you say, oh, the pancreas secretes the insulin that helps me regulate my blood sugar. Yes, it does. And you might have heard that the liver is what detoxifies the food that you eat, or the substances that you ingest, like alcohol and other drugs and so forth. And yes, it does that. But the pancreas and the liver also have digestive functions. And so to summarize, the digestive function of the liver, is to help you digest your fats. Break apart the fats. And the gallbladder also has the same function. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then to summarize the role of the pancreas, what the pancreas does is the pancreas secretes very powerful digestive enzymes that break down the carbohydrates that you consume. So the pancreas is actually a carbohydrate digester, and the liver and the gallbladder are lipid digesters. And you can see that the liver and the gallbladder have a duct that leaves from those structures and will empty out right here at the beginning of the small intestine. And you'll also see that we have a pancreatic duct that runs through the pancreas and has two outlets also here in the early part of the small intestine. So basically what happens is, as that food starts to pass into the early parts of the small intestine, the liver is going to secrete its components, and the gallbladder is going to secrete its components, and the pancreas is going to secrete its components, and basically bathe the food that is the digestive food that's entering that with its digestive components to break down whatever might be in there. So your second term is the term bile, which is what our body uses to digest the fats and lipids. So let me ask you a question. Let's say you've got a really, really greasy pan or pot from cooking something. So you've got this really greasy pot. How do you clean that pot? What do you use? Water and what else?
So, just
Soap. Yeah. What does the soap do to the grease? Kind of just dissolves it, right? Kind of gets it out, right? It kind of gets between the grease and the pot and kind of lifts it off the pot, right? And then it kind of dissolves into the water, right? It's an emulsifier. So what a fat emulsifier is it takes large chunks of grease or fat and breaks them into very small droplets so that they can be carried away. And that's what happens to the grease. It looks like it disappears, but what you've done is you've taken the larger grease structures or globs, if you want to call it, and breaks it into smaller pieces, and so they seem like they're so insignificant that they really don't exist anymore. And that's what bile does. That's what the bile does for your body. It will basically emulsify. It's like a detergent that breaks apart the fats into smaller components so that you can get the digestive substances around them so they can be transported out. That's what bile does. So if you consume any sort of fat or lipid, it has to be broken down by the bile. So we'll get to that in just a little bit, but let's look at the makeup of the small intestines. The small intestine, you see here, has these circular folds. But within the circular folds, you have the villi. But on the villi, you have microvilli. And so the reason why your body has these folds and the villi and the microvilli is because you want to increase the surface area available for absorption. So it is said that if you were to take your small intestine and actually stretch it out and flatten it out so that you get full use of the surface area, it basically covers the area of a tennis court. But that's within your body. It's pretty amazing. So you have that much surface area inside your body available for absorption. So here you can see that we have the circular folds, and on top of the circular folds, we have these villi. And then on top of the circular folds, we have microvilli called a brush border. They're going to release their own digestive components called brush border enzymes to help break down the food. So there's a lot of secretion and a lot of absorbing going on here, and there's a lot of surface area available for absorption. All right, so back to the liver now. So in the liver, now your liver does other things too, but the digestive structures of your liver are broken into sections called lobules, and they're hexagonal structures. They have 6 sides. And these lobules are filled with liver cells called hepatocytes, and those hepatocytes will produce bile. And then the bile ends up in these little tubes called canaliculi, which then merge into ducts, and then all that bile will end up making its way into one of these bile ducts that we see here, located in the periphery around that lobule. So the liver is the producer of the bile. Oh, wait a minute here. Let me just jump ahead here. Yeah, we don't really show the gallbladder. Okay, so here's the gallbladder. All right, so what's the role of the gallbladder, the significance? Now, the significance of the gallbladder is that it will receive the bile from the liver that the liver produces, and then it will draw the water out of it. So it's going to concentrate. It's going to concentrate the bile. All right? So the bile is going to be concentrated. So it's going to be like this concentrated detergent that is designed to break down and break apart the fats and the lipids. So essentially what happens is the liver creates the bile, stores it in the gallbladder, and then when your body needs it, the gallbladder is going to contract and squirt out the bile into the proximal part of the small intestine, and then that's proximal part of the small intestine then is exposed to the bile, so it can emulsify the fats in this area. Now, sometimes within the gallbladder, you end up with what we call bile salts or these bile stones. These large stones, we call them gallbladder stones, and this can cause a lot of pain, a lot of uncomfortable meals, because every time you start to eat, that gallbladder contracts. That's painful. And so you can remove the gallbladder. You don't need the gallbladder. And then what happens is the liver then will just continue to release bile, kind of like a trickle effect, kind of just trickle bile into that early part of the small intestine. So it has the same effect. If there's no food, the bile just hangs out there and accumulates, and then when the food enters, then it hits it. So it basically does the same thing. And people that I've talked to that have had their gallbladders removed said that, you know, they receive much more relief just getting the gallbladder taken out than restricting their diet and trying to decrease the amount of contraction from the gallbladder by decreasing the amount of fats. Because it doesn't matter. Your body doesn't necessarily selectively identify that you've consumed fats, which causes the gallbladder to contract. The gallbladder is going to contract no matter what you eat, you know, for the most part. So you're going to end up with the secretion of bile, whether you consumed a diet high in fats or not. So that's the gallbladder and the liver. And then we also have the pancreas. Now the pancreas, 70% of the pancreas is digestive. And only 30% is aimed at regulating blood sugar levels. All right? So what we see happen here is that the pancreas releases these very powerful digestive enzymes, several of them, trypsinogen, chymotrypsin, procarboxypeptidase, but they're all inactive. Remember in the stomach we had pepsinogen, which was inactive until it came into contact with something else? That's what we see here. So what we see is that the pancreas is going to release these enzymes. And one of the first ones that it releases is trypsinogen, or one of them, I should say, is trypsinogen. In your small intestine, the brush border has an enzyme called membrane-bound enteropeptidase. And when the trypsinogen comes into contact with that, it converts the trypsinogen into trypsin. Now it's active. It's a very powerful digestive enzyme. When trypsin is present, it converts chymotrypsinogen to chymotrypsin. And when trypsin is present, it also converts procarboxypeptidase into carboxypeptidase. So trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase are all these powerful digestive enzymes that are aimed at breaking down carbohydrates. So that's the role of the pancreas within the body, as far as digestion is concerned. All right, so this table here, 23.2, is a great table. It's going to show you an overview of the functions of the organs of the digestive system. So we've got the mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, moving on to the small intestine, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and then finally the large intestine. Also, we have the control of small intestinal motility, which is what gets the small intestine going, what gets that moving. Finally, we have the large intestine. By the time we get to the large intestine, most of the digestion has taken place, most of the absorption of the nutrients has taken place. Whatever ends up in the large intestine is primarily going to end up being excreted from the body as far as the foodstuffs, but the large intestine is going to be responsible for absorbing water. So your body will get rid of some water through the large intestine. That's why if you have like, a little bug, you have an intestinal bug, you have an intestinal flu, which we commonly call the diarrhea. The reason why your stool is very liquidy and very watery is because the transit time through the gastrointestinal system is so quick. And so your large intestine doesn't have time to absorb the water before your body eliminates it. But that's a protective measure through your body too. Your body's saying, okay, there's something that doesn't belong here in my gastrointestinal system, so I'm going to get rid of it very quickly. And the stomach does the same thing. There's something that doesn't belong, so before I pass it any further along the gastrointestinal tract, I'm going to send it back where it came from. That's why we vomit. Sometimes I talk to so many people and I forget who I say to what. Did I ever talk to you about why rat poison and mouse poison works? Did I ever talk to you about that in this class? No? Mice and rats don't have the ability to vomit. They don't have the ability to throw up. And our ability to throw up and vomit is actually a protective mechanism. It's a protective type of function. So essentially, like I said, if we ingest something that our body thinks is harmful, then we're just going to send it back where it came from. We're going to vomit. So when you put out the rat poison or the mouse poison or something like that, put that out, smells good to the mouse or the rat, the mouse or the rat eats it, they ingest the poison. They can't eliminate it from their body. They can't vomit it back up. So they have no choice but to ingest it, digest it, and absorb it, which is lethal. Then they die. Make sure if you do that, make sure that you have it in an open area so that way it doesn't stink like, to high heaven when they die and then they decompose and you can't find them because they're in your walls, right? That's not good. So, but that's how the rat and mouse poisons work. Can you tell I speak from firsthand experience? I did that years ago. I don't think I put it out. I don't even think I did. We had a mouse die somewhere in a wall somewhere, and our house stunk, like one part of our house stunk like rotten dead, decomposing animal for like the whole summer. It was disgusting. Disgusting. You couldn't find it anywhere. It was somewhere deep in the wall or something. Maybe it died of natural causes. I don't know, but it stunk. All right. I digress. So the large intestine, we have the what we call the cecum, which connects with the ileum, which is the end of the large intestine. So the small intestine, I didn't talk about this, has three components. We have the duodenum, two is the jejunum, and then three is the ileum. So those are the three subcomponents or the three areas of the small intestine. So the ileum matches up with the cecum. This is the ileocecal valve right here. So then the digested food ends up here in the cecum. Then we have the ascending colon. Then we have a bend in it that's called the hepatic flexure, because the liver is here. We call the liver the hepatic organ. Then we have the transverse colon. Then we have the splenic flexure because the spleen is up here. And then we have the descending colon, sigmoid colon, and then the rectum, which then leads to the anus. So within the rectum, we have some muscles. We have some that are involuntary, some that are voluntary. And so here we have what we call the internal anal sphincter located on either side. When the stool makes its way down here and starts to stretch the walls of the distal part of the rectum, the internal anal sphincter relaxes, allowing the feces to start making its way out. However, we learned through our potty training that you can't just go everywhere, right? So you got to go in the potty. You teach the 2-year-old, you got to go in the potty. So what we learn to do is we learn how to contract these muscles over here, which are called the external anal sphincters, which are skeletal muscle. And so the external anal sphincter can keep the bottom of the rectum closed or the anus closed until you get to a place that's convenient to defecate, and then you relax the external anal sphincter, and then you can go. It all works. Very pleasant to think about, isn't it? All right. Lying over the digestive components is something called an omentum. We have a lesser omentum, which kind of covers up the area of the stomach and the liver and so forth. And then we have a greater omentum, which is going to lie over the intestines. So this is the picture of the lesser omentum. And then we have the greater omentum, which they pulled up. So you can see here's the mesentery that kind of connects everything together. And from the side, you can see how the mesentery anchors everything in place, how it keeps things from moving around. The mesentery is basically there to keep things in their place so that it's not moving all over the place. Because very, very, very bad news if your intestines gets twisted. That's not good news at all. That could be very, very dangerous. This picture is showing you the defecation reflex, which I just had described to you before with the internal and the external anal sphincters. So that is it for that. So you have 2 attendance terms so far, right? So we have 1 more to go, and that'll be in this next one here. Let me just grab the PowerPoint. Okay, so learning plan 13, respiratory system is even more simplistic than the digestive system was. This is probably the most straightforward and the easiest learning plan you're going to have in this class. And that's because the respiratory system is essentially a network of tubes. And the primary purpose of the respiratory system is to bring air into your lungs or into the body, I should say, but into the lungs, essentially. Bringing air into the lungs because the air that we breathe is a mixture of gases, and we want to get one particular gas into our body and get rid of one particular gas. So we want to bring oxygen in, and we want to eliminate the carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct of our cellular metabolism. And that's the whole role of the respiratory system. To bring oxygen in and get the carbon dioxide out. That's it. So it's interesting that even though we can breathe through our mouths, whoops, let's go back here. We can breathe through our mouths, but we don't really consider, at least this book doesn't consider, most anatomy books don't consider, the mouth to be part of the respiratory system. Very interesting. So we have the nasal cavity, we have the pharynx, we have the larynx, we have the trachea, which we call the windpipe, we have the bronchi, and then we have the lungs. That is the respiratory system. That's it. There's not a lot to it. Talking about the nose, the external nose, is primarily cartilaginous. So what we primarily call the nose is made up of cartilage. The bony part of the nose, the bridge of the nose as we call it, are those two nasal bones that we covered in Learning Plan 6. That's the external nose. But the internal nose, or the internal part of the nasal cavity or nasal area, is right here, and it's divided into two places. We have a nasal septum that divides the left from the right. Remember these? The nasal concha, superior, middle, inferior nasal concha. Now the function of the concha is to help warm the air and to help filter the air as it comes in. So really your body prefers to bring air into itself through the nasal cavity because then it is a warmer and a filterer. So just like, I guess it's through the process of convection really, as you bring the air in and it runs through those turbinates of your nose, it's going to essentially warm them up. So by the time the air gets into your body, it's warmed. At the back of the nasal cavity, here we see the pharyngeal tonsils, which are also called the what? Remember those last week? Adenoids? Okay. So from there, from the nasal cavity, we move to the throat, what we call the throat, which is the pharynx. And we have three parts to the pharynx. And you see them here. We have the nasopharynx, which is the throat that's continuous with the nasal cavity. We have the oropharynx, which is posterior to the oral cavity. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is located right here. And that's because that is the part that is in the area of the larynx, which we also call the voice box. So here are the three regions of the pharynx. If you ever have a sore throat, they call it pharyngitis because it's an inflammation or an affliction that affects the pharynx. This is a table that's just showing you the general features and the description of the organs of the respiratory system. So we talked about these and we'll talk about them more. So this is the voice box. This is the larynx. The reason why I call it the larynx is because the structures that produce vocal sounds are found in them. What we call the vocal cords commonly, or the vocal folds more scientifically and more anatomically correct. You can see the relationship between the larynx and the hyoid bone. You can see that the larynx is kind of anchored to the hyoid bone. So even though the hyoid bone doesn't articulate with any other bone, and it's kind of floating there, you can see that it is very important in our ability to swallow in order to produce sounds, which become speech, and so forth. But the larynx is made up of cartilaginous structures here. You can see the large thyroid cartilage here, which has a prominence here that's more prominent in men than women. It's called the Adam's apple. And then we have a cricoid cartilage below that, and then we have successive rings of cartilage all the way down to the bronchi. So the larynx is basically what's going to connect the pharynx to the trachea. It's that voice box. If we cut open the larynx and we look at it from a side view, the sagittal view, you can see some structures here. So this structure right here is called the epiglottis. Kind of looks like a thumb sticking up from the side, thumbs up. And sometimes you can even see this on an X-ray. Call it the thumb sign. Epiglottis is covered with soft tissue. And the epiglottis's role is to basically fold down over the opening into the larynx to prevent food from entering the trachea. So, does anyone know how George Washington died? Did they talk about how George Washington died with you? No? Lots of stories today, I guess. George Washington, how did he die? You know? Well, he died because of epiglottitis. So he was riding his horse through a rainstorm, whatever, got sick, got a bacterial infection. The bacterial infection set up in the area of his epiglottis. So he had epiglottitis. So he had an inflamed epiglottis. Hard to breathe, hard to swallow. You can imagine if your epiglottis swells up, how difficult it'd be to talk, to breathe, to swallow. They didn't know what to do. They tried giving him lots of things like this thick maple syrup molasses type of thing that he almost choked on because he couldn't get it down to try to help. That didn't help. Well, back in the day, one of the ways thought was effective to treat maladies of the body was to bleed people. You familiar with this idea of bleeding people? So they thought if you had a sickness in you, if you let some of the blood out of the body, then that would eliminate some of the sickness and then cause you to produce more blood to replace that, and that blood would be healthier and then bring in health to you, eliminate the sickness. Kind of work that out. So they would bleed people so that they wouldn't be sick. So I thought, let's bleed him. But this is a very, very, very difficult decision to make, because this is George Washington, who's like more famous than famous, especially in the Americas. In the United States, he's like one of the founding fathers, first president of the United States. I mean, this would be like, big deal. And so these doctors are trying to figure out, do we do this? Do we not? Do we do this? It's kind of like, well, if we don't do this, he's going to die anyway. We got to do this. So they bled him. But at the time, they thought that there was more blood in the body than there actually is. So they essentially let out more blood than they really should have. So he actually died because he kind of bled to death. I mean, they didn't bleed him dry, but they took out more blood than was allowable. And so he essentially bled to death relative to their attempt to treat the epiglottitis. So that's how he died. Kind of crappy way to go, right? Now you know how George Washington died. He let out too much of his blood. Third term is the term glottis, which is relative to the epiglottis, but it's actually a term that's given to something you do with your vocal folds or vocal cords. So if you look from superior to inferior down into the throat, you're going to see the vocal folds. And the folds that you see in white are what we call the true vocal folds. Those are what are responsible for producing the sounds, and then lateral to those are what we call the false vocal cords or folds. So if you've ever had a balloon and you blow up a balloon and then you pinch off the end and then you kind of stretch out the end of the balloon and then it kind of squeaks as the air is moving out, that's essentially what happens when we speak. The vocal folds come together and we push air through it, and then the vocal folds will vibrate as they're pushed together. And then that's called a closed glottis, and that's what allows us to make sounds for us to speak. When the vocal folds are in the open position, open glottis, no sound. So if we're breathing and we're not talking, the vocal folds are separated. You can also perform other actions that involve the vocal folds, like coughing. And when you cough, what happens is essentially you're holding the vocal folds in closed glottis position, and then you force air up through from the lungs, and then you forcibly open up the vocal folds. But sometimes this is used in an attempt to clean off the vocal folds. That might be covered with mucus and other things. Moving down to the trachea, you see that the trachea is cartilaginous along the anterior 2/3, but then the posterior aspect of the trachea is soft. And the reason why it's soft is because of this structure right here, which is posterior to it, the esophagus. Because if you've got a bolus of food that you're swallowing, you want the esophagus to be able to expand downward into the trachea to accommodate for the bolus of food. So the back of the trachea is soft. The trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And this is what the cilia actually look like. Remember the role of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Produce the mucus, which sits on the cilia, and then the cilia have a wave-like action which gets the debris and pollutants out of the respiratory tract and back out. You can cough it out. The trachea leads to the bronchi, and we have two primary bronchi, and the primary bronchi bring the air into the respective sides lungs. So we have a right primary bronchus and a left primary bronchus, and they're going to bring the air into the lungs. And then once they get into the primary bronchus, then they go into the secondary bronchus, which is going to carry the air into a certain lobe of the lung, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then each lobe has segments, and so then we have the tertiary bronchi, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the bronchioles, which are more muscular than cartilaginous. But all these bronchi you see here are primarily cartilaginous. And then as they get smaller and smaller and smaller, they lose the cartilage and become more muscular. Okay, so before we do that, let's just look at what we have here on the screen. So we have the right lung and we have the left lung. Do you see any difference between the two? Take a close look. What's the difference? Yeah, you got the curve here, accommodate for the heart, and one has 3 lobes, and one only has 2. Right. Does anybody know why we have 3 versus 2? Some people will say it's because of the heart, but that's not the reason. You know why? Neither does anybody else. We don't know. It's just the way we're built. And you look at all mammals, and that's the way they are. You used to dissect, fetal pigs, and 2 lobes on the left and 3 on the right. It's just the way we are. Some people say because the heart is here. It's probably the strongest argument and case for that you could have, but that's just the way we're built. So we have 3 lobes on the right: superior, middle, and inferior. So how do you remember which has 3 and which has 2? This is the only way I can remember. That the word three has R in it, and R for right, I guess. That works. The way I can think of it, and left is the other one. Left is two. There's no R in right. There's no R in three. So three and right. So the right lung has 3 lobes. The left has 2. So instead of a superior, middle, and inferior on the left, we just have a superior and inferior on the left. So the lungs are not symmetrical. They're different from side to side. And we see this from time to time in the body, that we see an asymmetrical distribution. So like I said, as the bronchi get smaller and smaller, now we make way to the bronchioles. And the bronchioles are primarily muscular. So this is the part of the lung that gets affected in people who have asthma, because they have bronchoconstriction. And when the bronchioles are constricted, then it restricts airflow. And through the bronchioles, we have the terminal bronchioles, which lead to the respiratory bronchioles. The respiratory bronchioles will lead to the alveolar ducts, which are connected to the alveoli. And the alveoli are arranged in what we call alveolar sacs. So here's an alveolar sac made up of multiple alveoli. So this is the name of the game for the lungs. Exchange of gases. So we have the vasculature coming from the heart, pulmonary trunk, leading to the left and right pulmonary arteries, right? Dividing off right and left pulmonary arteries. They'll keep branching and branching until we get here to the alveoli. Then we have the exchange vessels here, the capillaries, pulmonary capillaries. And then after the exchange has taken place, now the blood is oxygenated, make our way back to the lungs, to the heart through the pulmonary vein. So the alveoli are primarily made up of simple squamous epithelial cells. Remember, the role of simple squamous epithelial tissue is for things to diffuse through. And in this case, it's oxygen and carbon dioxide we want to diffuse through. So we want that to pass through the wall into the capillaries so we can have gas exchange. But that's not all we see here. We actually see that not only do we have the type 1 alveolar cells that we just talked about, which allow for the exchange of gases, we have a type 2 alveolar cell, and we also have macrophages. Macrophages are immune structures. They help keep our lungs free of pathogens and other things that might be harmful to the body. But the type 2 alveolar cells often get forgotten, but they're very important. And they're showing them as kind of a green colored cell here. And the function of the type 2 alveolar cell is to secrete like a lipid type of secretion. So the function of that is to keep essentially the alveolus itself sort of lubricated. And this is designed to decrease what we call water surface tension. If you have a suction cup and you want that suction cup to stick really, really, really well to a surface, what can you do to enhance the amount of suction that that cup has on the flat surface? What can you do to the cup? Let's say you have those suction cup guns that kids play with. What do you do before you shoot them? You lick them. Why do you lick them? Because they're sticky. Because in your saliva is water. And water molecules bind to other water molecules through a hydrogen bond. And this is what we call surface tension of water. You can also take water and put it in a glass. You can fill it all the way up to the top. Then you can take a little dropper and you can fill it up with more water so the water will actually extend beyond the top of the glass, right? That's that water surface tension, which is great for some things, but it's not good for your lungs because your lungs are basically like these suction cups. And when your lungs collapse, when you breathe all the air out of your lungs, if you don't have the surfactant, what happens is that's like a wet suction cup sticking to itself. Now, to try to get that suction cup to open back up is a very difficult task. So your lungs secrete that phospholipid type of secretion, and we call that surfactant. And the surfactant is what keeps that alveolus lubricated, essentially. So now if you were about to shoot off that little suction cup gun, that little suction cup dart, and you sprayed it with cooking oil, and then you shot it, how well would that stick? Not very well. Because you've broken that surface tension. It doesn't have the ability to develop that surface tension water. So that's the general idea. Because the lungs are one of the last organs to develop in the fetus before birth, because the fetus doesn't need the lungs until it's born, this can be a problem for prematurely born infants, because the prematurely born infants don't have the full use of the type 2 alveolar cell yet. So usually in preemies, what you'll see is they'll have them hooked up to a respirator. The reason why they're doing this is to increase the amount of air pressure going into the lungs to help the lungs open, because they're not secreting enough surfactant to keep the lungs open like ours do. So that's one of the reasons. You all know where the lungs are located, I take it by now. So the lungs are anchored through a connecting stalk, and we call that the hilum of the lung. And this is where the bronchus hooks up to the lung, as well as the pulmonary arteries and veins. Yeah, cadaveric lungs don't look so hot. And they might have told you this too, for those of you who went to the cadaver event, that when a person is laying on their back, for example, the blood kind of pools in the back, giving the lung like a darker color, posterior aspect. Yeah, lungs don't look so great when they've been sitting around for a while, but actually in a healthy living person, the lungs are very pink. They're very pliable, very flexible, remarkable structures. This is just showing you sort of an overlay of how they fit into the thoracic cavity. A nice picture, nice cast of a bronchial tree. You can see the tree of the bronchi and how they branch out. And that's about it. I mean, there's not much to the respiratory system, like I said. When we get to advanced A&P and we start talking about the physiology of the respiratory system, then we have more to talk about. That's about it. What questions do you have? Anything we covered today? Let's just do a little bit of recap before we call it a day. So if you take the gastrointestinal system and you break it into two parts, what are the two parts that we talked about with the gastrointestinal system? One is the alimentary canal, I'll give you that.
Yeah, those are accessories or something.
Yeah, the accessory structures, they're accessory organs. So what would be the accessory organs of the gastrointestinal system? Two of them that we talked about that secrete
Pancreas.
things. What's that?
The pancreas?
Yep, pancreas is one,
No liver?
and the liver. What's the role of the liver? To emulsify what?
Fat.
Fats, right. It's kind of like a detergent, right? Yeah. So the liver creates, what's the green stuff that your liver creates to emulsify the fats? What is it called? Bile. And the bile gets stored where?
Gallbladder.
In the gallbladder, where it's concentrated. Pull the water out, it's concentrated. What does the pancreas do? Digest what?
Carbohydrates.
Carbohydrates, yeah, you got it, carbohydrates. And in that chapter, if you look, there are tables that tell you what the different digestive components are going to digest, or what digest the carbohydrates and the lipids and the proteins. We just didn't cover that because that's more what we cover in advanced A and B. All right, so tell me a little bit about the overall function of the digestive system. What's the function of the digestive system?
Break down food,
To break down food until what?
smaller pieces.
Into smaller pieces until they can be absorbed, right? Yes, exactly. And so there are different types of digestion. There's two different types of digestion that we talk about.
Mechanical.
One is mechanical, which is the actual physical churning of the food, or the chewing or grinding up the food. What's the other one?
Chemical.
Chemical, yep. So we see chemical digestion occur in the mouth through the saliva. We see chemical digestion occur in the stomach. The stomach is primarily responsible for digesting what kind of food?
Proteins.
Yeah, proteins. And so the hydrochloric acid isn't what breaks down the proteins, right? It's the pepsinogen that gets converted into pepsin. Yeah, pepsin, okay? So just remember that. So the stomach through the pepsin is what chemically digests the food in the stomach, and then we have the bile, and then we have the pancreatic enzymes that perform the chemical digestion. And we also have the enzymes in the small intestine, which are called the brush border enzymes. So those are all the structures that are going to create those chemicals that will digest and break apart the food. So what is the structure by which the absorbed proteins and carbohydrates enter the cardiovascular system by? Remember? There are two different structures that absorb. One was for the fats and one was for the proteins and carbohydrates. One's a capillary and one's a lacteal. So which one do the proteins and carbohydrates use? The capillary or the lacteal? The capillary, yes. And then the fats go through the lacteal, which is a basically lymphatic vessel. Yeah. What are some of the layers of the wall of the alimentary canal?
Mucosa.
Mucosa is the innermost. And then what's the next one out?
Submucosa.
Submucosa. And then what's next?
Serosa.
The serosa. Between that, we have a muscular layer too. The muscularis, they call it external. Or if we don't see the serosa, now the serosa is in the abdominal cavity. If we're in the thoracic cavity, it's not a serosa, it's called an adventitia. It's only different. Okay. And then talking about the respiratory system. What are the different components of the respiratory system? Air first enters what? Bless you.
Nasal cavity.
The nasal cavity. And then what's next?
Larynx.
Not the larynx, before that.
Pharynx.
The pharynx, then the
Larynx.
larynx, then the
Trachea.
trachea, and then the,
Lungs.
well, we have to go into the lungs through the bronchi, which then branch off into the bronchioles, and then we have the lungs. Yeah, you got it. What are the different types of cells in the alveoli that make up the alveoli? We have a type 1 alveolar cell, and what's its function? Simple squamous epithelial cell. What's its function? Diffusion. Allows the oxygen to get out of the lung into the capillary, pull carbon dioxide out of the capillary into the lung. Then when we breathe out, then the carbon dioxide gets pushed out. Yeah. Then we have the type 2 alveolar cell. What's the role of the type 2 alveolar cell? To decrease what? Not friction.
Tension.
Surface tension. Yeah, surface tension of the water. Think of the suction cup. So if you got a suction cup that's stuck together, and it's hard to break it apart, but if we squirt a little oil in there or a lubricant, now it's going to open up much more easily because you don't have the water sticking to more water. Remember, think of licking a suction cup. It's going to stick much more effectively. And remember, and the reason why there's water in the first place in your lungs is because water is one of the things that your body eliminates as its exhaust, so to speak. So the byproduct of your cell's metabolic processes, the waste would be water and carbon dioxide. So when you breathe out, you breathe on a mirror, you see the condensation on the mirror, that's because you're breathing out that water vapor. That's our body's exhaust. We breathe out water vapor. And so our lungs, the alveoli are just lined with water. And so when you breathe out and the lung and the alveolus collapses, when it collapses, now you've got water sticking to other water, and it's hard for you to open those up. It'd be hard for you to take a breath in, hard to break that surface tension. So the surfactant, which is the name of that secretion, the surfactant decreases the surface tension of water so that the lung can open up more easily.
Is that what happens when people's lungs fill up with fluid? That they can't break the surface tension?
Well, that might be part of it, and there's maybe an overabundance of fluid in there. But generally the fluid is not supposed to be in there, so that makes it difficult to breathe anyway. But that fluid is secondary usually to something going on in the heart. Usually if they have some congestive heart failure, now the blood is backing up, it's not getting out of the heart from the right side, so then it's backing up into the lungs. That's where you see that congestion, yeah. So people who have congestive heart failure, they start coughing, they have a lot of fluid in their lungs. It's usually secondary to the congestive heart failure. But yes, that can make it difficult to breathe as well. That's a summary of what we talked about today. 2 relatively simple learning plans. What questions do you have? Anything? We're good? Oh, yes.
I have one quick one about the, I wondered Blackboard and the participation and.
I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Let me just stop the recording and then I'll talk about that, okay? Any other questions? Okay.